In Malachi chapter 2, 1 through 9, we see God continue his reprimand of his own priests. At the end of chapter 1, we saw that his focus was about the way they were expressing their dedication to him through the offerings. But in chapter 2, we see that some of what happens when we get these things out of sorts is that it actually hurts others as well. When leaders fail, people are harmed. And in this case, the priests are not doing what God has them there to do, and he has at least several accusations against them. In verse 2, we see that they do not resolve to honor him. They don't have it in their hearts to be the kind of people who are actually leading the way when it comes to this type of wholehearted devotion to God that we talked about in chapter 1. So their own personal resolve is lacking to not honor God with their lives. But what that ends up meaning is in verse 8, they have turned from the way. So this seems to be a way of describing that their personal morality has faded, that they do not necessarily attend to the matters of the law with the type of dedication that they ought to. And so then, therefore, third, they have caused many others to stumble. He says back in verse 7 that the priests are supposed to preserve the instruction. They're supposed to be the people that people can look to say, how should we live? But because they have turned from the way, they are causing others to stumble. And then down in verse 9, we see that they are showing partiality in matters of the law. People would come to the priests and say, I have this dispute, I have this issue with my neighbor, help me figure it out. And rather than seeking justice and just simply trying to think what would be the most God-honoring thing in this situation, they show some kind of partiality. Oh, that's my cousin. Oh, that's my friend. Oh, they're going to do this type of favor for me economically, so I'm going to rule in their favor. And so because of this collection of problems, the priests, rather than becoming a source of help for the people, had been a source of damage. And so God actually has some pretty strong words to them. If we go back up to verse 2, it says, I will send a curse on you, and I will curse your blessings. Yes, I have already cursed them, because you have not resolved to honor me. Because of you, I will rebuke your descendants. I will smear on your faces the dung from your festival sacrifices, and you will be carried off with it. And you will know that I have sent you this warning so that my covenant with Levi may continue, says the Lord Almighty. So he says, because what you're doing is causing more damage than good, I will in some way stifle the effectiveness of it. Your blessings, I will curse them. Your festival sacrifices, I will actually make them a source of uncleanness for you. It's kind of a strange phrase, but he says, I'll smear the dung of the animals on your faces and you'll be carried off with them. I think what God is saying here is if I need to, I can actually remove you from your place of leadership. So that way the greater good of what I have in mind here for my people will be preserved. And so in fact, at times that is something we see God do through the Old Testament, that sometimes people who have been unfaithful are removed from that place of position. And in our own context, at times, God needs to remove people from their place of leadership for the greater good of his church. And this should be a sense of a warning for all of us that each of us probably has someone that looks to us as a leader. If you're a parent, your kids look to you and they're following you and finding out what does it look like to be dedicated to God. If we're in the workplace, maybe somebody knows we're a believer, and if they're not, they're learning from you what it is to be a believer. Even if you're a student, you have younger students who look up to you to figure out what does it look like to be dedicated to God. And this should give us a certain sense of burden of responsibility. In the book of James, it says that not many should presume to be teachers because you know that teachers are judged more strictly. They're scrutinized, they're examined. What are you saying? And so in the realms that we are someone that others would look to, how are we doing? Are we being sure to preserve the instructions of God on our lips? Are we making sure that there's nothing false that we testify to? Are we being honest and sincere in our way of following God's commands? And are we being a source of good for others rather than, of course, a source of them stumbling? This description of the priesthood uses as a contrast Levi as how it ought to be. Now, of course, Levi was the tribal leader of the group of people from whom the priests came. So Levi, the individual, is that ancestor that all of the priests are connected to. But in this text, Levi is used as a certain ideal of how a priest ought to be. It says in verse 4, "You will know that I've sent you this warning so that my covenant with Levi may continue, my covenant with him, a covenant of life and peace. I gave them to him. This called for reverence, and he revered me and stood in awe of my name. True instruction was on his mouth, and nothing false was on his lips. He walked with me in peace and uprightness and turned many from sin." That's how a priest ought to be. A priest ought to be someone that lives with peace and uprightness before the Lord. A priest ought to be someone that people can look to for the truth. That's how God says my priesthood should be. Now, unfortunately, during the time of Malachi and following, this did not, at least in any kind of permanent way, rattle the priests back to faithfulness to the way of God. Unfortunately, by the time of Jesus, it's actually chief priests who are among those who are arresting Jesus, accusing him of blasphemy, and seeing to it that he's executed. The priests, rather than being a source of good, rather than pointing people to Jesus, were in fact part of those chanting, "Crucify him." And all of this points to a need for a better priesthood, a new and superior priesthood than any human priesthood can achieve. And in fact, that is part of what the Bible tells us Jesus came to do as well. Not only is he our perfect sacrifice, as we talked about from chapter 1, but in chapter 2, we are reminded he is our perfect priest. Hebrews chapter 7 describes how Jesus' priesthood came with a certain superiority to the priesthood of Levi. Now, there was nothing wrong with that institution in terms of it being put in place by God, but of course it was always destined to suffer and fail because of it being occupied by imperfect people. And so Jesus came as a perfect priest who does not need to sacrifice for himself. Every priest in the Levitical priesthood had to offer sacrifices for themselves before they could ever sacrifice for the people. Jesus, sinless, though understanding every temptation we've ever faced, is eligible to be a priest of a higher order than Levi. And so the entire chapter, there's more there to say than we have time to say right now, gives us this description that Jesus comes in with a priesthood that takes everything that Levi gave and builds upon it to a perfect priesthood. And in doing so, creates a new reality for all of us who are attached to him. Somehow now we truly become a priesthood if we are believers in Jesus Christ. And so while the Levitical priesthood had its place where these particular individuals from that actual tribe were representatives of God in the community, now we are brought in as members of this new priesthood. This is exactly what Peter says in 1 Peter 2:9. You are a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, God's special possession, that you may declare the praises of him who called you out of darkness into his wonderful light. In some sense, now we are all priests if we are a believer in Jesus Christ. And the words of caution and warning should be resonant for each and every one of us, that let's make sure we have resolve in our hearts to honor him. Let's make sure that we don't turn from the way and in doing so cause others to stumble. Let's make sure that we seek matters of justice rather than partiality. Let's be a good priest. The Apostle Paul even describes his own ministry of sharing his faith, traveling around the whole known world. He describes it in Romans 15:16 as a priestly duty. He says, he gave me the priestly duty of proclaiming the gospel of God. Each of us, when we share our faith in our community, in our workplace, with our own family, we are doing a priestly act. We are pointing people to the way rather than pointing them away from the way. And we should take this warning, albeit with some strange statements of dung being smeared on our face and being carried off with the waste that comes from the festival, we should say, God, I want to be one of those priests that you find pleasing. I want to find one of those priests that is ministering in your throne room with our great high priest at the center of it all, and that I'm a faithful representative of you in this world. I want my coworkers to be able to look at me and say, this is actually what I should know about the Lord. I want my own kids to be able to look to me and see that I have pointed them in the ways of the Lord, rather than them finding out later that their dad held out on them. I want to be the kind of husband, the kind of neighbor, the kind of representative of God that can stand as an example with the truth on my lips. And I hope that's what you want as well. This is a warning to those priests in the time of Malachi. Come back to me. Come back to your duty as a priest and representative of me. If I need to, I can find somebody else to do it. He gives this ominous warning that he will carry them off, and their descendants will no longer be blessed because of their priesthood. Let's take that warning and say, God, you're gracious, but I want to be a priest that you're pleased with rather than a priest that you have to remove. He will do what he needs to do to preserve his covenant, even if that means getting us out of the way. So I don't know about you, but I'd rather be one that he's pleased with rather than one that he has to remove.